Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 72 for the first of Adar, the first in a leap year. So happy Rosh Chodesh. It is Rosh Chodesh today. It's Rosh Chodesh Adar Rishon, the first Adar. So this is a leap year, as I've been mentioning. So in a leap year, what makes a leap year unique is that it actually has two Adars. And what I think is really interesting about today's portion of Tanya that we're going to be learning is the topic for today is all about sadness and how to overcome sadness and why sadness is so bad and everything like that. And many of you may already know this, but the theme of the month of Adar is joy. So I think it's really interesting and apt that we're learning a chapter about how to overcome sadness, which will ultimately lead to joy right as we enter into the month of Adar. So this can hopefully get us to a place of true joy. So let's get into it. So another thing, just speaking about leap years, is something that I've mentioned also previously, is that the way that the Tanya portions are divided up for the year are different in a leap year as opposed to a regular non-leap year. And this is to accommodate this second Adar. So the portion that we're going to be learning today is actually the entirety of chapter 26. So there's quite a bit there. And in a regular year, this chapter is actually divided up into 3 sections. And so even though we're going to be learning the entirety of the chapter today, I would still like to break it down into 3 sections, because the 3 sections that the Tanya is divided, this chapter is divided to in a regular year are very thematic. So there were sort of like 3 themes of today's Tanya. And so I'll break it down in a basic kind of way, and I'll go through each one a little bit separately and give a sum up of each one. But now, before I get into that, I have to mention one thing, is that in preparing for today's episode and in learning this chapter, a certain scene came to mind for me from one of my favorite movies. It was my favorite movie as a child, and it's still a movie that is beloved by me today. It's called The Neverending Story. It is also a book, and it's a really amazing book. It's an amazing movie, and the book was actually a bestseller in many different languages all around the world, from what I understand. The movie actually cuts off in the middle of the book, and the movie finishes halfway through the book and then the book goes on. Anyways, it's not so important, but the main point I want to bring is there is a scene in that movie which is such a powerful scene as far as I'm concerned, and it's so powerful that and so related to today's chapter that I might actually link to that scene in the YouTube when I post this, so you can really have a visual to go along with it. And the scene involves something which is called the swamp of sadness. So just to give a little bit of context is, I don't have to get into the entire plot of the movie, but basically it's a story within a story. And so the story within a story involves this boy, Atreyu, who is the hero, and he is on a mission to save his world from the nothing, from this powerful force that's going to destroy his world. And along the way, he encounters many challenges and goes through all these travels, and it's like this really big adventure kind of thing. And along the way, he takes with him his beloved horse, and his horse is named Artax, and the horse goes with him on all these travels and and they get very close. And one of the encounters that they have is they come across this swamp, and the swamp, as we come to know, is called the swamp of sadness. And why it's called the swamp of sadness is because what happens is, as the person starts, or the animal or whatever it is that's trying to cross the swamp, as they begin to cross the swamp, they start to feel this overwhelming sense of sadness. And in order to get across the swamp, you have to really fight against this sadness, or else it really weighs you down so much that it could eventually take the person or the animal down into it, and the sadness could actually make whoever is trying to pass through the swamp drown into the swamp and not come out. And so the scene is basically where we see Atreyu and his horse, and they are traveling through this swamp, and you see them becoming really, really sad and starting to get weighed down. And Atreyu is a fighter, and he's really fighting, and he fights and fights and fights, and somehow he's able to overcome this sadness. But the horse is not having as good a time, and the horse starts sinking and sinking and sinking. And you see Atreyu pleading and screaming at the horse to snap out of it, to come out of it, not to let the sadness overcome him. And alas, it's really sad. It doesn't work. And the horse ends up drowning in the swamp of sadness. It's a really sad scene, and it's really powerful. And the reason why I bring it up is we'll see that this is really, really how the Alter Rebbe begins today's chapter, with this idea of the heaviness and the danger of sadness, and how sadness can weigh a person down so much so that it could literally take over their life and prevent them from being their full self. So as mentioned, this chapter is divided up into 3 distinct parts. So the first part is really about this sadness and what this sadness is and why it is so detrimental and why we should overcome it. He also goes into a little bit of like how there could be an advantage to sadness if it's used in the right way, but we have to be really careful about that, and that sadness does not really have a virtue on its own in terms of just being sad. So that's this first section. The second section gets a little bit more about specifically, the second and third section, I should mention, is more about like more particulars about different examples of when a person gets sad and how to overcome sadness in particular instances. So the second section is about sadness in terms of daily living and worldly affairs, like what to do if you start to feel sad or anxious about worldly affairs having to do with your family, with your life or health, or with your money and sustenance and things like that, how to overcome sadness there. And then the third and final section is about sadness and anxiety about existential kind of things and spiritual things. So mostly having to do with like feelings of guilt or shame or worthlessness and being worried about your own spiritual standing and what to do in those kind of cases if that kind of sadness and feelings of angst come to you. So those are the 3 sections. So let's get straight into the text, and we'll begin with this first section here. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that one should know that there's a very big principle that just like when you're trying to get a victory over something physical. For example, let's say if you have 2 people that are wrestling one with the other in order to bring the person down, if one of these people is very lazy and very heavy, then he is going to be won over very easily, and he will fall down even if he is stronger than his friend. So just to elaborate on this a little bit. So imagine if you have these 2 guys that are wrestling in a wrestling match, and they're both of equal strength or equal weight or whatever it is, or maybe even one of them is stronger than the other one. If that one that is stronger than the other one, if he is feeling sad and heavy, if he's like in this state of like kind of like despondency, there is no way that he's going to win that fight, no matter how strong he is. And so now the Alter Rebbe says that this analogy that we're using with physical fighting and with physical wrestling is very applicable to our fight with our Yetzer Hara. So if you recall, we talked about this idea about how we have this internal battle all the time between our 2 souls, our animal soul and our godly soul. You can go back to previous episodes to hear more about that, and about how it's like 2 kings that are trying to rule over the city, which is the body. And when one of them rises, the other one falls, and you can't have both kings ruling the same nation. So our mission in life basically is trying to constantly overcome our evil inclination, constantly overcome our animal soul and win over it. And so what the Alter Rebbe teaches us here is that he says that similar to these 2 wrestlers fighting in a physical fight, this is true with our fight against our evil inclination. We cannot win it if we are in this state of laziness and heaviness. And where does laziness and heaviness come from? Like, what's the source of this laziness and heaviness? It comes from sadness, and it comes from a blockage of the heart, like a rock. And rather, how is it that we could win over the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, is with alacrity. And where does alacrity come from? Alacrity comes from joy and the opening of the heart, having an open heart, and having it purified from any vestige of worry and sadness in the world. And so, so basically, to understand this, just basically in order, if we want to overcome any evil inclination that we have, any negativity, we need a certain motivation. We need to be in a certain state of like energetic, be somewhat energetic. And where does this energeticness come from? This alacrity that we need to like conquer the day. When people say like seize the day, it comes from joy. And if we don't have this joy, then it's just going to bring us down. So before we go further, maybe, if you could take a moment to really think about this in your own life and see if you can think about a time in your life when maybe you weren't at your best and you weren't being very accomplished in what you needed to do. And then think about other times in your life when you were very accomplished, when you were very productive and active and everything. And what was your state of mind in both of those times? Most likely in the first time you were kind of in this heavy, sad state. Maybe that was, maybe something had happened. Maybe you had gone through a bad breakup. Maybe, there was a tragedy that you suffered, something like that. And those kind of things can really bring a person down and make a person not be very productive. And then think about why it is that sometimes you do wake up and you are feeling more productive. What's going on in your life in those moments? Most likely you're in a happier frame of mind and in a good state of mind. So this could be why, for example, so many people drink coffee, believe it or not. So, when we think about drinking coffee or drinking caffeine, people usually think, why do I drink caffeine? It's in order to give me energy. But what's actually happening is that it's not so much that the caffeine is giving you energy, it's that it is inhibiting the blockage of dopamine receptors. So dopamine, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with neurobiology or psychology or anything like that, you'll know that dopamine is a neuromodulator, otherwise known as a hormone, which leads a person to feel feelings of motivation, of drive, of wanting to conquer the day, those kind of feelings. And so what happens is when we drink caffeine, it's not that the caffeine brings in more dopamine, but the caffeine allows for more of that flow of dopamine to happen in the brain. So the basic idea is that even on a physiological level, we can see and understand this thing that when we have more of this sense of motivation and joy and happiness, this is going to actually give us physically energy, which is what happens when we drink coffee, for example. So now getting back to the text. So now the Alter Rebbe brings up a verse from Mishlei, chapter 14, verse 23, which seemingly seems to contradict or seems to at least add some kind of question to what the Alter Rebbe is teaching here, where it says, B'chol etzev yeh mutar. So, which literally means that in every sadness, there is an advantage. So this seems to say that there is something good about being sad, right? So there is a time and place for being sad and there's something good about it. But the Alter Rebbe says, no, we have to read the verse in a more literal way. When you look at it really more specifically, you'll see that what it's saying here is that there is nothing good about sadness in its own right. And the only way that it has an advantage to it is that if an advantage comes out of it, if there's something good that comes out of it. So in every sadness, there should be an advantage that comes out of it. So what is the advantage that could come out of sadness? This is the true joy in God, your God or his God, that comes after the true sadness at very specific times when a person feels a certain bitterness in their soul and through a broken heart. And that through this brokenness of the spirit, of the impure spirit and the sitra achra, and the barrier of iron that is separating between him and his Father in heaven, meaning God. And then now the Alter Rebbe brings a teaching here from the Zohar on a verse from Tehillim, chapter 51, verse 19, where it says, "Ruach nishbera, lev nishbar, v'gomer," which literally means a broken spirit and a broken heart you will not despise. So, and then if you look in the same Tehillim, a few verses before that, in verse 10, it says, Tashmi'eni sason v'simcha v'gomer, that you make me hear joy and gladness. So what the Zohar does is it connects these two things together. And it says that how is it that you get restored to joy and gladness is through a broken spirit and through a broken heart. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this is the simple reason why the Arizal instituted that we should say this Tehillim, where it's talking about this idea of a broken spirit and broken heart and joy and everything like that. So this is Tehillim 51 again, so that we should say this after saying Tikkun Khatsot, before learning, in order that our learning should be with true joy in God that comes after sadness. So just to give a little bit of background with this, so there's this thing called Tikkun Khatsot, which some Jews say, which is basically a prayer where people wake up in the middle of the night. It's set at midnight, and it's about where we mourn over the temple and mourn over our exile and everything like that. And it's like kind of like a time for a person to really contemplate their sins and contemplate their inequities and think about how that's contributing to the exile that we're in. So it's a very sad kind of thing. But so what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is that, well, after saying this Tikkun Khatsot, the Arizal instituted that we should say this prayer, this Tehillim, in which we learn about how a broken spirit and a broken heart can lead a person to true joy, to really take this sadness that a person gets in this time of Tikkun Khatsot, that's most likely going to make them very sad if they do it properly, and transform this sadness into a bitterness and a brokenness of the heart that will lead to true joy. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that this joy, this true joy in God that will come after sadness, is a really, really deep joy, because this joy has a huge advantage in the sense that it's the same way that light has an advantage when it comes out of darkness rather than just light itself. So if you imagine this idea of, let's say if you've been in a really dark cave for a really long time and you haven't experienced a lot of light, you are going to appreciate light so much, or let's say like if you've ever had like a blackout in your house and the electricity's been down and everything, and then all of a sudden the lights go on, it's like you have this huge feeling of joy, and you really appreciate that light. And in a more emotional state, you can think about this also if you've ever, God forbid, been in a really deep, dark place, like a depression of some sort, or just like really in not a great state, and then you overcome it and you emerge out of it, then the joy that comes from coming out of that deep state is a very, very deep joy. And then to support this, then the Alter Rebbe brings a quote from the Zohar, and this is from the book of Kohelet, chapter 2, verse 13, where it says about Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, so that literally means that I saw that there was an advantage to wisdom over folly, just like there was an advantage to light over darkness. So same idea of basically once if a person is in a state of folly and then they have this like revelation of wisdom, that's a huge, like that wisdom is going to be so much more valued and so much more valuable than if it was just wisdom and it's on its own without that preceding folly. And then the Alter Rebbe also further supports his argument for the fact that joy is really important by bringing a selection of a verse from Devarim, chapter 28, verse 47, where it says, that meaning that, and that's referring to the fact that because you did not serve God, your Lord, with joy, then all of these punishments will come to you, God forbid. So basically it's the precept of serving God with joy is not just like this like extra little thing that's nice, it's good to be happy, but basically it's something really essential and crucial for our service of God. And according to the Arizal, which the Alter Rebbe is sort of hinting at here at the very end of this section, is that this is specifically referring to the fact that the Jews need to serve God with an added measure of joy when they are in a state of lack and affliction and not in the best space. So that's the end of this section. So just to again, give a little recap, is what we learned so far is that we learned that being sad is really not a good thing because it really weighs a person down and it makes us unable to, it brings a state of lethargy and a state of heaviness, and this making us unable to win our fight against our evil inclinations. Just like if you have two wrestlers and one of them is really heavy and weighed down, they will be unable to win the fight, even if they're very strong and very muscular and everything. And then we talked about how this state of sadness really, really has no value on its own. And there's nothing good about being sad in your own right. But if you are able to take your sadness and if you're able to use it for a very specific purpose in order to serve God, then it could have an advantage. And so what is that specific purpose, and how, and specifically to move it into a state of where you can become joyous, is if you take very specific times and you use this sadness to come to a state of bitterness, which leads you to brokenness of your heart and your spirit. And that from this state of brokenness of the heart and the spirit, this allows for space for God to enter in and for God to take you out of your sadness and transform you into a state of joy. So now that we've learned about why sadness is so detrimental and not something that we should really just accept, and as well as the idea of how we're supposed to transform sadness into joy, we're going to get into the next sections, which make this a little bit more practical and give practical examples of things in your life and how to specifically implement this when you practically are feeling sad, when feelings of sadness or feelings of anxiety come up. So this next section that we're going to learn about is, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a section on feelings of sadness or feelings of angst over physical matters, worldly affairs, such as your family, such as your livelihood, such as your health, things like that. So let's get into the text and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So the Alter Rebbe says that here, the advice that is given to purify one's heart from any sadness or any vestige of worry from worldly affairs, and even when it comes to your family life or your actual life, like your health or your parnasa. So in Hebrew, it's b'nei chayai muzaneh, which kind of like encompasses all things having to do with worldly affairs. It is known to everybody, the saying of the sages, that the same way that we bless over the good, we also bless over the bad. So this is something that maybe many of you know. There's a bracha that we say when we hear very bad news. If somebody, God forbid, passes away or whatever, there's a bracha that we say where we say the blessed is the true judge. So there's this concept basically that like when we serve God and when we bless God, it's not only in times of overt happiness, but we actually are supposed to bless God at every moment, and we're supposed to accept that everything comes from God. So the Gemara explains, the Alter Rebbe says, that we are supposed to accept with joy, just like the revealed joy that is revealed to us and that is seen to us. We should accept that this too is for good, just that it's not revealed to us and that it's not revealed to our eyes of flesh and blood. And why? How come it's not revealed to us to our eyes and flesh and blood? Why can't we see if everything really is good? Is basically what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. It's just some things we see as good and some things we don't see as good. So the Alter Rebbe says that this is because these things that are concealed from us and that we don't overtly see as good are coming from Alma Descartes. So what is Alma Descartes? Alma Descartes is a Kabbalistic term which literally means the hidden world. The hidden world is above Alma Desgalia, the revealed world. So there's this concept in Kabbalah and Chassidus that there's these two worlds. There's the revealed world and there's the hidden world. So the revealed world is the world in which we see, which is very accessible to us. And then there's the concealed world, which is sort of like the behind the scenes of everything. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that the Alma Desgalia and Alma Desgalia, they are both related to the different letters in the name of God. So when we talk about the Tetragrammaton, which we've mentioned previously, the 4-letter name of God, it's Yud and then Hey and then Vav and then Hey. So we don't pronounce it out loud, but so it's made up of 4 letters. And so the Alter Rebbe is explaining to us that the revealed world is the last 2 letters, the Vav and the Hey. And the concealed world is the first two letters, the Yud and the Hey. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this explains the verse in Tehillim, chapter 94, verse 12, where it says, Ashrei hagever asher tiesrenu ka v'gomer. So happy is the man whom you, God, chasten. So I'm saying ka, but really it's because that's how we don't pronounce the name of God out loud, but it's really the letters Yud and Hey. So basically, if we look at it now with the context of what we know about the revealed world and the hidden world and the letters and everything, it's that basically it's saying that happy is the one who the Yud K, which again, that is alluding to the hidden world, chastens. So meaning to say that we should recognize the fact that when we are quote unquote chastened, when we quote unquote experience afflictions or suffering or things that are unpleasant in this world, it's not that these things are bad. It's that these things are coming from the hidden world, and which is the world of the first two letters of God's name, the Yud and the Hey. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that this is why the sages taught that those who are happy in afflictions, about them, it is written, Ve'ohavav ketzet hashemesh bigvorato. So that's a verse from Shoftim, chapter 5, verse 31, which literally means those who love him, meaning love God, shall be as the sun when it comes out in its might. So what is this talking about? So the Alter Rebbe says, so first of all, so joy is related to love. So when we say, those who love him, so it's when we are joyous, when we feel joyous, this is coming from a state of love for our nearness to God, and that we love God, and we love God more than anything in the world, any physical matters. And then for this, the Alter Rebbe brings a citation from Tehillim, chapter 63, verse 4, where it says, Ki tov chastecha michayim, that how great is your chesed, your loving kindness. It's greater even than life itself. And so keeping in mind this logic, so this idea that the Alter Rebbe is saying that basically true joy comes from this love of God and wanting to be really, really, really close to God. And so where is the closeness to God? What is so close to God? So the closeness to God is actually in a much stronger way to an infinite degree in the concealed world, in Alma Descartes. Why? Because there, the hiddenness of his power is lodged. And there he is, and these are a few verses. I don't have to give the citation for each one of them. It's just a small thing, basically, that it's also saying that Yoshev Beseter Elyon, that God is sitting hidden up high. So all of these things that the Alter Rebbe is citing, it's basically to support this idea that the real like closeness to God is actually in this hidden world. That's where it's like God is, so to speak, more intense. And so thus there's this idea that basically those people, so this explains why those people who rejoice in afflictions, they will merit to having the sun come out in its glory, in its full strength in the future. Because what is this referring to is basically that in this world that we're living in now, we know this physically, even we can't look at the sun directly, right? It's covered up in a sheath. It's like in order to protect us from the intensity of the sun, it's covered up in a sheath, and we can't look at the sun directly unless we have sunglasses or some kind of coverings or whatever it is, right? But in the future time, what's going to happen is that the sun is the sheath will be removed from the sun. And in the future, those people who are able to rejoice in suffering are actually going to enjoy this direct sunlight. And so what this means on a spiritual level is that in the future time, this concealed world, this Alma Descartes, is going to be revealed, and it's going to radiate, and it's going to shine with great revelation that's very intense to anybody who seeks shelter from it in this world, and try to get safe in its shadow, which is, what is the shadow? The shadow is the shadow of wisdom, which is, wisdom is the aspect of a shadow, and it's not actually light, and it's not something that's revealed good. So so that is the second section of this chapter. And so just to recap that and try to explain it a little bit more, is what the Alter Rebbe basically is teaching us here is that what should a person do if a person comes across times in their life when they feel a sense of sadness or angst or anxiety over worldly affairs, whether it has to do with their family, their livelihood, their health, God forbid, anything like that. So first things first is to recognize that everything comes from God and God is only good. So everything is really good. It's just a matter of what we are able to see and not see. And so some things are revealed to us as good and some things are not revealed to us as good. And then secondly, what the Alter Rebbe explains is not only is it that some things are revealed, some things are not revealed, those things that are hidden from us, those things that don't seem to be good to us, are actually coming from a much higher place because they are coming from the concealed world, from the Alma Descartes. And this concealed world is concealed because it's kind of like and the Alter Rebbe doesn't get into it too much here, but I think it's important to mention, is that it's too intense for us to be able to really handle in its full glory. So just like the sun, if you think about it, the sun is really beneficial to us. It's the way we see anything, the way so much of our lives depend upon sun and sunlight. However, as mentioned, we can't look at the sun directly. We can't get anywhere near the sun. We would not be able to handle it. So thus, in order to benefit from the sun, we need a certain amount of concealment from the sun. So similarly too, in order for us to experience God's radiance in this world, it needs to come down through a certain series of concealments. And we're actually going to get into this a lot more and further on in the Tanya, but just it's important to mention it here because it's relevant to this idea that basically, so what the Alter Rebbe is basically teaching us is that those things which we experience as good and are revealed good in our lives are, yes, they're good because everything's good. But those things which we do not experience as good, God forbid, and that we just they're concealed from us. It's not that they're not good. It's that they are good because they come from God. And if anything, they actually are more good in a certain sense because they actually are more intensely close and connected to God by virtue of the fact that they're concealed. Like their concealment proves to us or shows us, demonstrates to us that they're actually coming from a higher place because that world of concealment is a place where God radiates in a much more intense way. And in the future times, we're going to all experience this. So in the future, then it says physically the sheath will be removed. And so physically as well, or spiritually speaking, the Alma Descartes, the hidden world is going to now become revealed in this world. And so the more we train ourselves to experience this now, the more we are able to really meditate upon this idea of really trying to see the good in everything, the more this will prepare us to experience this in the future in a way that we can really rejoice and bask in this sunlight, so to speak, and actually physical sunlight as well. And I think it's interesting just that last little line that the Alter Rebbe ends off this section with, where he talks about how wisdom is the aspect of shade and not light, and it's not totally revealed. So this is perhaps my own understanding of it, but I think what that's basically teaching us is that wisdom is something which isn't necessarily revealed, like it's something that we're not all wise all the time. Wisdom is something that you kind of have to acquire, or even if you have wisdom inside of you, you kind of have to uncover it. So it's not something that's overt and in your face. It's something which really needs to be cultivated and brought to light. And so that's that same idea. So wisdom is also just like this concealment, this world. It's sort of like this Alma Descartes, the hidden world is like this hidden wisdom that's inherent in everything. So you can think about it kind of like, it's kind of like the behind the scenes of something that's going on. So like Purim is coming up, for example, and that's a huge example of that, is that like there's the revealed story of what happened in the story of Purim. This happened, that happened. And the entire book of the Megillah, there's actually no mention of God's name, which is really interesting because it's like at no point, it's not like at Mount Sinai when God physically came down and spoke to everybody and it was very revealed. In the story of Purim, it's a lot more subtle than that. So in the story of Purim, if you just look at every individual part, it doesn't even necessarily seem like a very religious book or a very godly kind of book. But then when you understand the full context and you see the story in its full light and you see the wisdom behind that whole story, that's when it comes out. That's when you see the wisdom. That's when you see God. And that's when the whole thing becomes lit up, so to speak. It's like you're lifting the veil and you're turning on the lights. So that's kind of like what it's talking about here. Okay, and so now we have reached the final section of this chapter where the Alter Rebbe will talk about spiritual angst, about when a person feels a sense of sadness or anxiety over spiritual matters. And so specifically, this is in regards to their spiritual stature. So this would encompass things having to do with like feelings of guilt or shame or self-worth or things like that. So I'm sure this is something that we are all familiar with to some extent or another. So let's get into the text and see what the Alter Rebbe says about it. So the Alter Rebbe says that the feelings of sadness about spiritual matters, a person needs to set aside and decide within yourself to get rid of these things. For sure, during times of service to God, because while we are serving God, then we need to be serving God with joy and with a good heart, like gladness of the heart. But not only while serving God do we need to be in this state of joy, but also even while we were working, like while we're involved with worldly affairs, while we're just going about our day-to-day life. If during these times of going about our lives, we start to feel a feeling of sadness and worry about spiritual matters, then a person should know that this is nothing but the machinations of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination, in order to make a person fall, and specifically to fall into different taivas, so different like desires and temptations, God forbid, as is known. Because if not, where are these feelings of sadness, true sadness, coming from? Like, is it really that a person is in the middle of business and doing their business, and suddenly they feel these feelings of love of God or fear of God, and this is what's leading them to feelings of sadness? Like the Alter Rebbe is saying, like, come on, no, it's not coming from a good place. So the Alter Rebbe says that whether these feelings of sadness come to a person during times of service, like while you're learning Torah or praying, or if they come to a person while they are actually not in service of God, but just in your daily life, you should set aside in your heart and you should say, this is not the time to be thinking about these things, even if this is in regard to really severe sin. So let's say, God forbid, it's like somebody did actually commit some kind of really severe sin. It's not the time to be thinking about this while they're serving God or while they are working, but rather what should they do is they should set aside a specific time, like at a very opportune time, that when they are in a more calm state of minds, like a more settled state, to meditate on the greatness of God and to really think about how they sinned against God. And through through setting aside these specific times and making it into this time of meditation and contemplation, this will lead to a broken heart, a true broken heart that will lead to true bitterness. And when should this time be? So the Alter Rebbe says that this time should be, it's explained elsewhere when these times should be. And specifically this, he's going to get into this further in the Tanya when we get into Igeres HaTshuva. So stay tuned for that. But the main idea is that there needs to be specific times to do this. And then the Alter Rebbe says that through doing this, through setting aside these specific times and meditating and coming to this brokenness of the heart, this is the method by which to remove the sadness from the heart completely. And because he will then believe, the person who's doing this meditation will have true faith and complete faith that God is going to take off this sin, and God is great to forgive. And this is true joy in God that comes after sadness, as we explained above, that there's a certain joy that comes from a place of sadness after the place of sadness, like in this kind of contrast kind of way. So that's the end of that section. So just to recap that, so what the Alter Rebbe basically is teaching us here is that feelings of sadness or shame or not feeling good about ourselves and our self-worth and things like that, it's not good to, if we experience these feelings just like out of nowhere, like if they just like come to us out of the blue, it's not good to dwell on them, whether it's while we're praying or while we are learning Torah or while we're working or going about our daily lives. The Alter Rebbe says, if you do come across these sensations of sadness, you should know it's not coming from a good place, and there's nothing good that's going to come from it if you dwell on it. And in fact, it's just going to bring you down. But rather, you should set aside specific times to meditate in a proper way on this, and that will lead you to a sense of a true broken heart and a true brokenness of the spirit. And that is what's going to lead you to ultimately allow God to come in and bring you to true joy. So I think one way to kind of understand this and understand how this works is by, and this is my own little interjection here, but is to understand this like through basic psychology. And when we look at people, whether it's, so we've talked in Tanya, obviously, about serving God and about sadness and guilt and shame over serving God. But I think this can be applied to pretty much any type of shame or guilt. So for example, let's take a very simple example of somebody who is on a diet. They're trying to lose weight, right? So let's say part of the diet is that they're not allowed to eat any sugar or any wheat products, and this is going to help them lose weight. So, okay, so they're going great, whatever. And then lo and behold, one time they eat a cookie. They're tired or they're in a bad space or whatever it is. So they eat a cookie. Okay, not the end of the world, right? So is it or is it not? So that is the question. That is that is where the mindset comes in. So often, and this is a trap that I think a lot of people tend to fall into, is we tend to mistaken feelings of guilt or feelings of shame for something good. So I don't want to get too political here, but like what this brings to mind kind of is like virtue signaling, where there's this kind of like perception nowadays that the mere fact of feeling shameful about something, like, you know, like let's say if you admit that you are a racist or you admit that you live in this like racist culture, even if it's like you never did anything racist in your whole life, that somehow makes you a good person because you are admitting your sins, you're owning up to your sins, and you're feeling shameful, you're feeling guilty. And so similarly, you know, the person who ate that cookie, there's this sense of like, oh my gosh, they need to feel guilty. They need to feel that sense of shame. And if they feel that shame and guilt, that actually is what makes them a good person. But what the Alter Rebbe taught us in today's Tanya is no, that's actually not the case. And we see this very much true in practicality, that what happens when a person feels that shame randomly, you know, they eat the cookie, they broke their diet, and then they immediately feel this sense of shame, or let's say it's like later in the day and they suddenly remember it and they're like, oh, I'm such an idiot, why did I eat that cookie? It's just going to bring them down, and most likely it's going to lead them to eat another cookie and another cookie and another cookie, you know? And so too, when it comes to like virtue signaling or feelings of, you know, self deprecation in general, all that does is it really just brings a person down. And it's like the more you tend to shame yourself and the more you tend to think of yourself in this negative way, especially if it's just like at these random times without any real direction or purpose, and there's no like resolution of how you're going to stop eating that cookie in the future, how are you going to stop being racist, you know, how it is, all these kind of things, it's just going to make you into a worse of a person most likely. And it's going to make you weaker and more apt and open to falling in the future. And so the remedy for this, as we learned, is really to, rather than just let these feelings overtake you in the moment, and whether it's like right after you eat the cookie or during the day or, you know, whatever it is, but rather set aside specific times. Set a time when you're not emotional, when you're not feeling flustered and just it's coming out of the blue and you should be focusing on something else, you know, like set aside specific times to really focus on self-improvement, to really focus on where you're at and where you're holding, whether it's with your diet or whether it's with how you feel about other people of different races, you know, or whatever it is, and really do true introspection. And obviously here in Tanya, it's talking about more spiritual introspection and more our service of God. And through that might be a very confrontational experience because it might lead you to really come to the root of why you did what you did, or really make you realize what you did and make you realize the ramifications of what you did and how bad it is for you. You know, like maybe in the case of the cookie, you might realize like, wow, this one stupid cookie, it really threw me off incredibly. I was so frazzled. I really didn't feel good about myself. And, you know, it will get you more in touch with what's actually going on in a real way and bring you more face to face with yourself. And that, yes, that's going to bring you more down in the moment in a way, but in a true way, in a way that it will actually break your spirit and break your heart, which, as we learned from the Tanya today, is actually what's going to lead to true joy afterwards, because it's like you're making space for God, you know, like through, as we've learned in previous episodes, when we really break our spirits, when we really break ourselves down and we get rid of our ego, that's what makes space for God to come in and where we really trust in God and we trust that he's going to take over and he will forgive us and he will embrace us and we can return to him. So I hope that was clear. I know it was a really pretty long episode today because of the full chapter, but yeah, if you have any questions or comments or anything, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If any of this really spoke to you, if you have any personal experiences you want to share with all of this, please leave some comments in YouTube. I love seeing comments. So please do that. And otherwise, and in any event, I will speak to you tomorrow when we will move on to chapter 27. I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.